Welcome, dear followers. How are you? Imagine a darkness so profound it presses against your very soul, a silence so complete that the frantic beating of your own heart becomes a deafening roar. Picture a man, known to the local villagers as Elias, lying still within a newly fashioned wooden box, his features drawn not by peace but by a sudden violent illness that had seized him only 2 days prior. The air around him, thick and cold with the scent of pine and freshly turned earth, was a suffocating promise of finality. This was the scene not of rest, but of the most dreadful error. His neighbors, gripped by fear of the swift contagion and a desperate need for closure, had decreed his passing with undue haste. There had been no lengthy vigil, no second opinion sought from the distant city doctor, only a grim certainty born of panic. Elias's family, crushed by grief and swayed by the village elder's somber pronouncement, had allowed the undertaker to seal him away. They believed his pallor, his lack of breath, and his unresponsive eyes were the incontrovertible signs of death. Little did they know that this profound stillness was merely the deepest trough of a peculiar paralytic fever, a state known only to a few ancient physicians as a temporary deadly masquerade. The clock was ticking, measured not in hours, but in the rapid consumption of the stale, meager air surrounding his face. If you enjoyed the story, please like and share. Encourage viewers to enter their location and local time. Now, try to let your imagination run wild. The chill was the first sensation to register, a deep, pervasive cold that seemed to seep not merely into his skin, but into the marrow of his bones. Elias's memory was a sudden, jarring fracture. One moment, he had been struggling for breath in his bed, the fever burning him from within like a wick. The next, this profound, unsettling darkness. His eyelids fluttered, heavy and dry, and he tried to lift his head, only to be met with a hard, unyielding surface just inches from his nose. His hands instinctively pushed outward, bumping against wood to his left and right, and he realized with a sickening, dizzying lurch that he was utterly enclosed. Not in his bed, not in his room. A metallic tang like old copper was on his tongue. The realization came not as a gradual dawning, but as a lightning bolt of sheer, paralyzing horror. He was in a coffin. They had buried him. The sheer absurdity of it warred with the suffocating terror. He had to be dreaming, a final, cruel hallucination spun by the fever. He tried to call out, to scream, but the effort yielded only a dry, rasping gasp that seemed to be instantly devoured by the thick wooden shell surrounding him. The darkness was absolute, a perfect velvet void, and the close proximity of the wood panels meant that he could not even turn his head freely. This was not the vast, open darkness of night. It was a sealed, finite space designed to hold the departed forever. A memory, fleeting and sharp, pierced the terror. His wife's face, wet with tears, leaning close just as the fever had pulled him into the abyss. But was that really her voice, or a phantom of his fading consciousness? He remembered a faint, sweet smell, not of sickness, but of lilies and polished wood. He tried to kick, and his boots, heavy and cumbersome, struck the far end with a solid thud, a sound that reverberated painfully within his skull, but seemed muffled and weak to his own ears. He pounded his fists against the lid, a dreadful, frantic drumbeat against the silence of the earth above. The wood was too thick, the screws too tight. The dreadful mistake was not merely a tragic error in judgment. It was now a physical barrier, an inescapable silent prison that was consuming the very air he needed to sustain his miraculous, unwanted return to life. The emotional moment was that first surge of adrenaline that instantly banished the fever's languor, replacing it with the raw, fight or flight energy of a man facing the ultimate, inescapable fate. The strange detail was the complete lack of any sound from the world above. It was too soon after the burial for true silence, which meant the box was even more insulating than he could have feared. The initial, frantic burst of movement, The desperate, muffled kicking and the futile hammering of his hands on the lid had only served to solidify the dreadful truth. Elias ceased his thrashing, forcing his body into a horrible stillness, a chilling echo of the state that had brought him here. He regulated his breath, shallow and measured, trying to conserve the precious dwindling oxygen. The darkness, which had initially been a simple lack of light, now felt like a physical entity pressing down on his chest. It was the smell that anchored the terror, a heavy mix of freshly cut wood, the faint cloying sweetness of the funereal linens, and the unmistakable dank scent of earth permeating the box from all sides. He lifted his hand, his fingers brushing the interior lid. It was smooth, polished, and utterly unyielding. He traced the line where the lid met the sides, feeling the minute ridges of the seal, designed for permanence, not for egress. In the suffocating silence, the only audible things were the ragged intakes of his own breath and the relentless booming rhythm of his heart. Every beat felt like a finite measure of the time he had left. His imagination, which usually was a source of comfort, became his tormentor, painting vivid, agonizing images of the soil piled heavily above him, tons of cold, unfeeling earth pressing down on his final resting place. He recalled, with an agonizing clarity, the sound of the dirt hitting the coffin lid during his cousin's burial years ago, a heavy, resounding drum that signaled final separation. He listened now, straining every nerve, but heard nothing. This deep silence was a terrifying clue. He must be quite deep. The reality of his burial was confirmed not by sound from the outside, but by the oppressive lack of it. He began a more systematic exploration. He was dressed in his best wool suit, stiff and unfamiliar, and his feet were encased in polished leather boots. He shifted his weight, trying to turn slightly onto his side, but the confines allowed only the smallest, most agonizing rotation. His right arm, extended upwards, felt a sudden strange difference in texture near the curve of his shoulder. It was a lump, something not quite part of the interior lining. He pressed against it tentatively. It was hard, small, and metallic. He worked his fingers around it with great difficulty, finally managing to pry the small object loose. It was a small, ornate locket, a piece he had given his wife on their wedding day, containing miniature portraits of them both. The minister, in a misguided gesture of comfort and finality, must have slipped it into his pocket after his family had paid their respects, believing him gone forever. Why was it here? The question was a momentary distraction from the claustrophobia. But the strange detail was the fine, almost imperceptible film of moisture on the metal. It was not sweat. It was colder, almost dew-like. This single, damp object, taken from the warm moisture of his body and placed against the cool, isolated wood, felt profoundly unnatural. The locket was an unexpected, bittersweet connection to the world above, an emotional moment of crushing grief and fierce longing, reminding him of everything he was fighting to return to. The sudden desperate thought was not of escape, but of a message. If he died, perhaps this locket, found later, would tell the tale of his conscious, terrible final moments. But this grim acceptance lasted only a heartbeat. He had been given a second chance, a life-saving jolt that had woken him from the fever. He would not surrender it to a hasty plot of earth. He held the cool metal tightly, the pressure of the locket a tiny, painful anchor in the absolute void. Wondering, was this a sign of luck, or merely a tragic, final souvenir?
The locket, clutched in his sweaty palm, provided a moment of poignant, though terrible connection, but it was useless for his current predicament. Survival required action, not sentiment. Elias pressed his ear hard against the cold, smooth wood of the side panel, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to hear any sign of the world above. He listened for the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, or, most impossibly, the faint tread of footsteps. All he received was the profound, mocking silence of the earth. He tried to rationalize. Surely someone would be walking nearby. Was it possible the burial ground was so remote? Or was the coffin itself a masterpiece of acoustic sealing? The mysterious question was immediate and agonizing. How far away was help? And was the thickness of this wood truly insurmountable? A fresh wave of panic threatened to overwhelm him. He could not merely lie here and wait for the air to run out. The thought of a slow, conscious suffocation was a fear so potent it tasted like acid in his mouth. He began to shout, not the wild, desperate yells of before, but controlled, guttural sounds, aiming to maximize the vibration through the wood. "Help! I'm alive! I'm alive!" The words were instantly absorbed, turning to heavy, damp echoes in the confined space. He paused, listening intently after each strained cry, hoping for an answering sound, a pause in the silence, anything. There was nothing. The strange detail that followed was the realization that the effort of shouting was consuming too much oxygen. The air already felt thicker, stale, and warm from his exertion. He could feel a faint, dizzying lightness at the edge of his vision, and the frantic pounding in his temples intensified. He had to stop. He lay still again, forcing his mind to reject the panic and embrace cold logic. He was buried. He was conscious. The box was sealed. The challenge was purely physical. He shifted his focus to the weakest point of his prison. He felt along the lid again, his fingers searching for any gap, any loose fitting, or any screw he could manipulate. He found a slight, almost imperceptible looseness near one corner, a tiny space where the wood felt marginally less solid. It was the joint where the lid was fastened. He pushed his fingers into the crack, scraping his nails against the rough wood, trying to widen the fissure by sheer pressure, but the effort was useless. The joinery was too strong. This was the emotional moment of absolute despair, the point where the human spirit, having fought and failed against an absolute barrier, threatens to break. He felt a sudden powerful urge to simply close his eyes, accept the inevitable, and slip back into the paralysis that had brought him here. But then, a flicker of fierce indignation ignited within him. His life had been taken by a mistake. He would not surrender it quietly to the ground. He realized he was still wearing his large, heavy wedding ring, a thick band of gold that had often felt cumbersome. It was solid, and though blunt, it was the only tool he possessed. He began to scrape the edge of the ring against the slightly softer wood near the corner of the lid, a slow, agonizing effort designed not to break the seal, but to create dust, a fine, tangible sign of work in progress. The sound was a grating, tiny rasp, barely audible, but it was his sound, the sound of resistance against silence. And for the first time since waking, Elias felt a tiny, desperate ember of hope against the overwhelming nightmare.
While Elias was fighting his lonely, agonizing battle in the subterranean dark, a drama of a quieter, though no less compelling nature was unfolding above. The man who had prepared the grave and helped lower the unfortunate Elias into the earth was named Thomas. He was a man of the soil, heavy of limb and taciturn by nature, who had dug graves in this small ancient village for 4 decades. He was respected for his strength, his steady hand, and his profound, almost spiritual reverence for the act of interment. But since covering Elias's coffin, an unsettling shadow had fallen across his conscience. Thomas sat now in his small, earth-floored cottage, the smell of damp soil clinging stubbornly to his boots and clothes. He nursed a cup of weak tea, but his mind was not on the warmth. It kept returning with a strange, obsessive persistence
to the sound of the final earth falling onto the lid of Elias's box. It was a sound he knew intimately, a sound that usually brought a sense of grim finality, a closure to the living. But this time, it had been different. He recalled standing at the edge of the pit, his shovel resting against the fresh mound of earth. He remembered the last layer of soil being tamped down and hearing, or perhaps feeling, something irregular. It was not a clear sound, like a shout or a crack of wood, but a kind of dull, internal displacement, a tiny, almost musical thump that seemed out of place. He had dismissed it instantly as the settling of the planks or the movement of a stray stone against the wood. Yet, the memory lingered like a troublesome splinter. He had been so sure of the death, Elias's stillness, the chilling pallor, the quick decision by the community. But his deep professional intuition now murmured a disquieting question. Had the earth settled too quickly, or had something moved below? The strange or unexpected detail was the behavior of his old faithful working dog, Keeper. Keeper, a creature that never ventured near the churchyard after nightfall, had been intensely agitated after the burial. The dog had whined softly, circling Thomas's feet, refusing to eat its dinner, and spent the entire evening staring fixedly towards the direction of the cemetery, a low, persistent growl rumbling in its chest. Thomas had merely scolded the animal for its foolishness, but the dog's unnerving behavior now amplified his own vague sense of foreboding. An animal's instinct, Thomas knew, was often clearer than a man's overburdened mind. He rose suddenly, unable to bear the quiet oppression of his cottage anymore. The emotional moment came when he recalled Elias's face. He remembered smoothing the soil, a traditional gesture, and seeing a slight, almost imperceptible twitch near the corner of Elias's mouth. Again, he had dismissed it as a trick of the candlelight or the reflection of the clouds. But now, fueled by the dog's anxiety and the phantom thump, the image became a vivid, accusatory memory. He had performed his duty with respect and dispatch, but the speed of the whole affair now tasted bitter. He had worked fast to prevent the fever's spread, perhaps too fast. Thomas picked up his lantern and his favorite, sharp-edged shovel. He told himself it was just a final check, a need to ensure the grave was properly finished and secure against animals or vandals. But as he stepped out into the deepening twilight, he knew the real, terrifying reason pulling him back to the silent field. He had to know if the silence he had imposed was truly the silence of death, or the terrible living silence of a man trapped. Was this persistent unease merely a consequence of age, or a genuine warning whispered by the earth itself?
Inside the wooden box, Elias had reached a point of excruciating, numbing fatigue. His efforts with the wedding ring had been slow, painstaking, and ultimately inadequate. He had managed only to scrape a small indentation in the wood, creating a fine, dry powder that coated his hands and face, offering more psychological solace than actual progress. The rasping sound of the gold against the oak had been both a terrible comfort and a maddening reminder of his impotence. He paused, resting his cheek against the chilling inner curve of the coffin lid, breathing the warm, increasingly heavy air in shallow, deliberate sips. He knew the frantic brute force method was useless. His only chance lay in a calculated, precise attack. But how does a man with no tools, in absolute darkness, breach several feet of earth and a thick wooden shell? It was in this moment of deepest physical stillness that the memory, sudden and luminous, flashed across his mind, a flashback to a childhood promise. Elias saw himself not as the condemned man, but as a boy, perhaps 10 years old, watching his father prepare for a journey. His father, a shrewd merchant who traveled long distances, had a peculiar fear of being waylaid and held for ransom, or worse, of being robbed of his precious goods. Elias remembered a conversation tucked away in the dusty attic of his mind, where his father had confessed a strange habit of preparation, a habit meant to safeguard his secrets even in the face of death. Elias, his father had said, his voice low and serious, always have a last recourse, something small, something unexpected that can give you an edge when everything else is lost. The last recourse. What was it? The memory solidified. His father had shown him a small, custom-made pouch sewn meticulously into the inner lining of his traveling cloak. It wasn't for gold or jewels, but for a single, useful, easily concealed item. A chill, unrelated to the damp earth, ran through Elias. His family, following tradition, had dressed him in his finest, heavily tailored traveling suit, the very same suit his father had bequeathed to him, the one he wore only for the most solemn occasions. Could it be? The suit was thick wool lined with a heavy satin. He began to explore the inner seam of the jacket near the small of his back, straining his arms against the confines of the box. His fingers, now numb and clumsy, finally encountered a patch where the satin lining felt thicker, less flexible, a place where the thread count was almost doubled, a small, deliberately disguised pocket. The mysterious question was answered by a tremor of desperate excitement. His father, a man of profound caution, had indeed included this feature in the garment. With a monumental effort, Elias worked his thumb under the heavy stitching. It took him perhaps 10 minutes of painstaking, silent labor, the wedding ring now acting as a crude but effective hidden blade, to finally saw through the threads. His fingers plunged into the secret pouch. The strange detail he pulled out was not a weapon, but a small, carefully oiled and folded piece of fine, flexible metal, perhaps a foot long, culminating in a tiny, flattened hook at one end. It was a tool his father had described as a grave picker, a thin, tempered steel strip used for delicate lockpicking, or, more darkly, for manipulating things from a distance. The emotional moment was the overwhelming, sudden surge of fierce gratitude and hope, the realization that his long-deceased father had, through a forgotten idiosyncrasy, gifted him the possibility of life. This piece of metal, a sliver of unexpected hope, was his only key to the vast, heavy lock of the earth.
The small, oiled strip of metal was a tangible anchor against the vast, crushing terror of the earth. It was a miraculous inheritance, but Elias knew instinctively that the tool was meant for delicacy, not destruction. His greatest enemy was not the wood, but the time it would take and the rapidly diminishing reserve of breathable air. He had to think of a way to utilize the grave picker to breach the coffin seal without requiring a massive expenditure of oxygen. The close air was already thick and humid, tasting heavily of pine resin and his own desperate exhalations. Every movement, every moment of concentration burned a measurable quantity of time. He shifted his body, a slow, agonizing process of wriggling and pushing, until his back was firmly pressed against the bottom of the coffin. This allowed him a small degree of purchase and the ability to work above his head where the lid was sealed. He focused on the corner he had previously identified as the weakest point, the spot where the wedding ring had scraped away a fine powder of wood. The agonizing work began. Using the flattened hook of the metal strip, Elias gingerly inserted it into the minute space between the lid and the side panel. The metal was thin enough to enter, but not thick enough to pry the strong, reinforced lid. He began to scrape, not against the wood, but against the hidden, tightly set iron screws he instinctively knew must be holding the lid in place. He worked by touch alone, his fingers mapping the cold, hard resistance of the metal fasteners. The task was torturous. The flexible tool vibrated painfully in his hand, and the sound it made, a high-pitched, insistent squeak of metal grinding against metal,
was amplified horrifyingly in the small chamber. It was a constant, internal siren announcing his location, yet no one was there to hear it. He found the first screw head and began the slow, meticulous process of working the hook edge around it, trying to catch the slots of the flathead screws to turn them. It was a crude, impossible task, akin to trying to empty a lake with a thimble. After what felt like an eternity, he realized he wasn't turning the screws, but gouging out the soft wood immediately surrounding the heads. The strange detail was the temperature difference he felt. The metal tool was cold, but the wood where he worked was becoming noticeably warm from the friction, a small, localized heat in the chilling interior. The emotional moment came when his hand cramped so violently that the small tool slipped, falling with a dull thunk onto his chest. For a moment, he simply lay there, defeated, his muscles trembling uncontrollably from the strain and the oxygen debt. Tears of frustration and fear welled in his eyes, but he refused to cry out, conserving his breath. He whispered his father's name, a silent plea for strength. He retrieved the tool and recommitted to the work. He had learned something crucial. The goal was not to remove the screws, but to weaken the structure until a forceful push could shatter the bond. The mysterious question now was, how many more screws were there, and could his strength and the air last until he breached the last one? He estimated there must be 4 on this side alone. He continued his agonizing excavation, his only compass the feel of the yielding wood giving way around the uncompromising metal.
Back in the world of the living, bathed in the cool light of the moon, Thomas, the gravedigger, was following the irresistible pull of his disquiet. He carried the heavy shovel draped across his shoulder, its well-worn wooden handle familiar and comforting against his calloused hand. The churchyard was silent, possessing that deep, heavy quiet that only burial grounds truly know. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dew and cut grass, but to Thomas it also carried the faint, disturbing aroma of unsettled earth. He reached the fresh grave, marked only by the mounded soil and a small temporary wooden cross bearing Elias's name. The mound looked perfectly normal, a tidy monument to tragic haste. He stood there for a long time, his old dog Keeper standing rigidly beside him, its low-frequency growl now replaced by a tense, focused whine, its nose pointing directly at the center of the grave. The dog's persistent unease was the final, undeniable validation of Thomas's own intuition. He began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the fresh earth, his boots crunching softly on the scattered gravel. He stopped suddenly, leaning down to examine a detail that an ordinary mourner would never notice. The fresh soil, dug just hours ago, had a strange, minute imperfection. Near the head of the grave, where the last final clods of dirt had been patted down, he saw a nearly invisible displacement of particles. It was as if something heavy and solid had shifted from beneath, causing the loose surface layer to slide down a fraction of an inch, leaving a tiny, unnatural ridge of finer dirt at the base of the mound. He ran his hand over the disturbed spot. The soil was firm, but this tiny detail was the strange and unexpected clue that crystallized his fear. Thomas dropped the shovel, the clang echoing harshly in the night air, and knelt, putting his ear close to the ground. He listened intently, shutting out the rustle of the night wind and the distant croaking of frogs. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the rush of blood in his own ears. Then, faint, almost imagined, he heard it, a tiny rhythmic sound, a persistent, high-frequency grating, like the sound of a mouse gnawing on a hard seed, coming from deep within the earth. It was intermittent, stopping for long stretches, then starting again, an unmistakable mechanical sound, utterly foreign to the natural decomposition of the earth or the coffin. It was a terrifying, mysterious question answered in a single, chilling sound. Something was working down there. The emotional moment was the transformation of vague dread into a powerful, adrenaline-fueled certainty. Thomas's years of service, his solemn respect for the dead, were suddenly overshadowed by a fierce, protective urgency for the living. He snatched up the shovel, his weariness forgotten. He had been an accessory to a fatal error, and now he had a chance, however slight, to reverse it. He plunged the blade into the earth just above the sound, digging not with the measured rhythm of interment, but with the frantic, powerful haste of a man fighting against time itself.
The rhythm of the spade hitting the earth became a frenzied counterpoint to the distant, internal rasping Thomas had heard. He dug with a lifetime's practiced efficiency, yet his movements were fueled by an unfamiliar, desperate dread. The topsoil flew away in dark, heavy arcs, followed by the stiffer, clay-rich earth beneath. Thomas was focused entirely on reaching the wooden shell that lay below, his shovel biting deep, driven by the unwavering certainty that he was engaged in the most vital task of his long career. The rhythmic thud-thud of the shovel against the damp soil was loud, yet he strained to hear the faint sound of the living below the noise of his own rescue attempt. After clearing the loose fill, he began to perceive the sound more clearly. It was no longer a vague grating. It was a definite, deliberate scraping and tapping, uneven and desperate, undeniably human in its pattern. The mysterious question of the sound's nature was now terrifyingly resolved. Elias was not merely alive, he was actively, consciously fighting his way out. The thought lent Thomas renewed vigor, transforming his solitary effort into a shared battle against the heavy indifference of the ground. Thomas paused only when the shovel struck something hard, not the rock of the earth's floor, but the distinct, hollow reverberation of wood. He had reached the coffin. He tossed the shovel aside and dropped to his knees, clawing at the remaining dirt with his bare, thick hands. He swept away the loose soil from the lid, revealing a dark, smooth expanse of wood, and a horrifying sight. Near the head of the box, visible through the remaining film of earth, was a patch of raw, scraped wood and a thin, irregular line that looked suspiciously like a fracture or a seam that had been violently stressed from the inside. He placed his ear directly onto the cold, damp wood. The sound was now a sharp, immediate tap, 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 clearly transmitted through the thin barrier. He heard something else, too, a shallow, wet gasping, the sound of a man fighting to draw air into lungs already strained by confinement. The realization brought the emotional moment of sickening dread. He was only moments, perhaps seconds, from suffocating the man he was trying to save. He called out, his voice hoarse and loud, "Elias, can you hear me? Stop! Stop tapping! It's Thomas! I'm here, man! I'm digging you out!" A moment of profound silence followed from below, a silence more deafening than any noise. Then a single, weak thud responded, a final, weary affirmation. The strange detail was the discovery of a tiny, glittering fragment of metal embedded in the scraped wood near the point of impact. A tiny piece of tempered steel, the point of the grave picker that had either broken off or been deliberately sacrificed in the man's final exhausted attempts to breach the seal. Thomas, understanding the man's plight and his meager tools, knew he could not risk striking the lid with the shovel again. He had to lift it.
Thomas knew that his remaining time was measured in the man's failing breaths. He had exposed the coffin lid, but it was still locked tight, secured by the screws Elias had been agonizingly working around. The gravedigger acted with a focused intensity born of decades of intimate labor with the earth. He grabbed the shovel and, instead of digging, used its strong, flat edge as a lever. He drove the tip of the shovel deep into the narrow space between the side of the coffin and the wall of the grave, creating a slot large enough to insert the head of the blade.
He located the corner that Elias's efforts had weakened, the spot where the faint metal shard had been found. Thomas applied his entire weight to the shaft of the shovel. The wood of the coffin, already stressed by Elias's internal struggle and the pressure of the surrounding earth, offered a moment of stubborn resistance before yielding with a sharp, wrenching crack. The sound was like a bone snapping in the profound stillness of the night, a violent rupture of the false peace of the grave. He repeated the movement, leveraging the shovel further, causing the heavy lid to shift and rise by a few agonizing inches. A terrible, fetid burst of stale, warm air escaped the chamber, carrying with it the sickening proof of Elias's struggle and consumption of the limited oxygen. Thomas dropped the shovel and threw himself at the exposed corner, using his immense strength to rip the coffin lid back, tearing the remaining wood and twisted metal free from the box. The lid slammed onto the side of the pit, and the sudden, brilliant light of the full moon poured into the deep, dark cavity. The light revealed the scene in stark relief. Elias, dressed in his dark suit, lay curled on his side, his face white as plaster, his eyes wide and staring, the lining of the coffin shredded near his hand, and his skin smeared with a fine layer of wood dust and sweat. The emotional moment was that of blinding, raw relief. Elias saw the moon, a perfect, luminous circle, and the immense, comforting silhouette of Thomas framed against the sky. It was not merely light that entered the box, but the intoxicating, fresh, and cold air of life. Thomas reached down instantly, his hands grasping Elias's cold, limp arms. "Hold fast, man! I have you!" The rescue was a slow, difficult extraction. Elias's body was heavy and completely inert, having given its last vestiges of energy to the fight. He was pulled, unresisting, from the pit, his clothes torn and earth-stained, and laid gently onto the cool, dewy grass beside the open grave. Thomas checked for a pulse, faint but present, and laid his ear to the man's chest, hearing the shallow, irregular beat of a heart that had almost succumbed. The strange detail was Elias's wedding band, the crude tool of his resistance, which had twisted tightly around his swollen finger, a shiny, golden circle against the bloodless white of his hand. Elias was alive, pulled back from the absolute brink, saved by a gravedigger's intuition and his own fierce, desperate will. The struggle was over, the healing had begun.
The cold night air, the scent of the disturbed earth, and the sight of the limitless sky were the first sweet medicines administered to Elias. He lay trembling on the grass, weak and nearly speechless, but profoundly present. Thomas, the stoic gravedigger, quickly moved from rescuer to caretaker. He retrieved his heavy cloak from the cottage and wrapped the pallid, shivering man in its coarse wool, the warmth of painful shock after the subterranean chill. He sat with Elias, not asking questions, but simply lending his silent, solid presence, occasionally murmuring encouragement. The faithful dog, Keeper, came and rested its large, warm head near Elias's hand, a silent, living connection that anchored him back to the world. The first struggle for Elias was not physical, but psychological, the absolute total rejection of the darkness that had held him. Every time his eyes drifted closed, the terrifying pressure of the coffin lid seemed to return, a sensory memory so powerful it caused his body to jerk and gasp. The road to recovery would be long, a slow process of convincing the mind that the grave had not claimed its due. Elias eventually helped walk the short distance back to the gravedigger's cottage. The scene of the empty, broken coffin lying abandoned in the moonlit pit was a powerful tableau of the miracle that had transpired. Thomas, being a practical man, slipped away before dawn to retrieve Elias's astonished wife, Sarah. He told her the impossible story in simple, direct words, presenting the shredded, dust-caked man as his own proof. The reunion was the profound emotional moment. Sarah did not see the suit or the dust, she saw the life in his eyes. Her relief was not expressed in hysterics, but in a quiet, deep embrace, the simple fact of his warmth and breath and incomprehensible joy. The village was, of course, stunned. The hasty burial, spurred by fear of the contagion, became a lesson in caution and humanity. The doctor, summoned from the city to examine Elias, pronounced his condition a rare form of cataleptic fever, confirming that the stillness had indeed been a death-like trance. The following months were dedicated to regaining strength. Elias spent his days sitting by his window, letting the sun warm his skin, relearning the simple rhythm of life outside the confines of four wooden walls. He never spoke much of the experience, keeping the memory of the absolute silence and the desperate scratching a private terror. The mysterious question of why he survived became the profound truth of how he would live. He understood that every breath, every sunrise, was an unearned gift. His final healing came with reconciliation, not just with his family, but with the earth itself. One clear spring afternoon, Thomas arrived at his door, not with a shovel, but with a stout, young pine sapling. Together they walked back to the churchyard, filling the empty, dark pit with earth and planting the pine directly over the site of his ordeal. The strange detail was that Elias used his recovered wedding ring to make the first symbolic scrape in the soil for the planting. He and Sarah visited that tree every year, watching it grow taller and stronger, a living green monument to the day he was given back to the sun. Gradually, the shadows of that terrible night began to recede, fading like a nightmare at the first touch of dawn. Elias and Sarah would often sit on the small stone bench they placed near the growing pine, the gentle afternoon breeze rustling its needles, the soft sound a profound contrast to the stifling silence he had endured. His movements became slower, less hurried, infused with a peaceful appreciation for the quiet persistence of life. He learned to cherish the small, comforting sounds of the world, the distant ringing of the village bell, the hum of the honeybees around the flowers, and the steady, rhythmic thump of his own heart, not the frantic rhythm of fear, but the deep, regular beat of continued existence. The experience had taken much, but it had left him with an unshakable sense of peace. The ultimate fear had been faced and overcome. Having touched the absolute zero of existence, everything else felt like boundless warmth. Elias no longer sought the great adventures or the loud pronouncements of the world. He found his happiness in the familiar shared warmth of his hearth, in the simple, quiet companionship of Sarah, and in the profound gratitude for the life that flowed, unburdened, through his veins. He was a man who had left the earth only to be reborn from it, rooted now with a deeper, richer understanding of what it meant to simply be. The pine sapling grew tall and strong, its deep roots weaving a pattern of endurance into the place where he had fought for his life, a silent, green assurance that even the darkest, deepest error can be overcome by the persistent, unyielding light of hope. Elias lived out the rest of his days, long and full, an unexpected gift to those who loved him. The end of the story. Sweet dreams.